All right. Well, thanks, Shelley, and thanks everybody for coming out on this beautiful summer evening here for a little refresher on composting. So, as Shelley said, my name is Diana Alfuth, and I'm the Horticulture Outreach Specialist for Extension, University of Wisconsin Division of Extension. I cover Pearson and St. Croix counties, but a little beyond that as well. And I get a lot of questions about anything and everything to do with plants, but especially composting. There's a lot of great interest in composting. It's a great thing to do, a great way to recycle your garden waste into wonderful, usable product. So lots of times compost is called gardener's gold because you just can never have enough of it. It's a wonderful soil amendment and helps your plants do well. And so we're going to talk about the basics of composting. Now, when I say the basics, I mean everything you need to know about composting because it's really not complicated. It's very, nature is going to compost things one way or another, whether we intervene or not. And that's what happens in the woods. The leaves fall down and they turn into that nice crumbly composted humus down in the base under the leaves in the woods and stuff. So nature will compost things, but we want to do it in a controlled way and maybe speed up the process so that we can then use that in our yards and gardens for other purposes. So it's really quite simple, but you just need to understand a few of the basics to be successful at it. And it doesn't have to be a big ordeal. So composting, again, is just using the natural process that's going to happen to change organic waste. And when I mean organic waste, we're talking about anything that was once a plant. Now, you can compost other stuff like, animals and stuff like that, but we don't want to get into that. That's a whole different set of microbes and stuff going. So what we're talking about is anything that was once a plant. And we want to get it into this nice crumbly stuff that's in the picture here that looks like Oreo cookie crumbs. And those are, that's what's going to be really useful in the garden. So it could be grass clippings, it could be food scraps, it can be leaves, anything that was once a plant can be composted and turned into this wonderful stuff. So again, we're trying to speed up the natural decay process. Here's a picture of a bin. I'm going to get my little marker going here. So here's a picture of a bin where people have been dropping their yard waste, and that's compost in the making. Okay, you don't actually need a bin. You can just have a pile out back somewhere. So again, that's even simpler. It's probably not something you want in your front yard because it's not the most attractive thing. But a good compost pile, if you're not putting meat scraps or the wrong things on it, which we'll talk about soon here, it's not going to smell. It's just going to be earthy smelling. So it's not something that your neighbors are going to get mad at you about or anything like that. But the composting, in order for things to compost, there needs to be four things, okay? There needs to be oxygen, basically air. There needs to be moisture, water. There needs to be food, and what we're talking about is food for the microbes that do this job for you. And then there has to be the right temperature. So we really don't get much composting happening when it's February and 20 below out there because things are frozen. But these are the four things to keep in mind. So if you've got a compost pile and it's not composting, it's not breaking down like you think it should, these are the four things that you're going to look at to adjust to get it, to kickstart it and get it going again. So let's talk about the benefits of compost and why we want to do this. First, the garbage doesn't take yard waste anymore, right? If you live in a town that has a municipal compost site, they might have a place where you can come and drop your leaves and yard waste, or they might have, a couple of pickups a year in the fall or something like that. But not everybody has that. So in one sense, it's a way to get rid of your yard waste. But remember that it is not a fertilizer. So yes, it's full of nutrients, okay? And that's what makes it really, really good. But most often, to have maximum growth on your plants, like your vegetables or your annual flowers or wherever you use the compost, you will still use some fertilizer, okay? Compost will have all of the micronutrients in it, and that's what's great. So there are 17 nutrients that all plants need in order to grow, okay? And we're not going to go through them all in this talk, but in order for a plant to grow, it has to have all of them. So what that means is that any plant that you throw on your compost pile, or any parts of the plant that you throw on there, has all of those 17 nutrients in it, okay? Because they were taken up when that plant grew, and they are in each of those cells. So that's what's really great about it, is if you put compost on, you know that you are adding all of the tiny little micronutrients that your plants need to grow. Because if those previous plants that have now been composted didn't have one of those nutrients, it wouldn't have grown, okay? So most of the time when we do fertilizing, the fertilizer bags have 3 numbers on it: nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. And that's because those are the nutrients that plants need in the largest amounts. But what gets challenging for me is, so I follow some gardening groups on Facebook just to kind of see I'm a lurker, okay, see what's going on out there. And there are all kinds of home remedy recommendations to add to your garden. None of which are science-based, but it's kind of folklore or that sort of thing. So especially tomatoes, everybody wants to grow great tomatoes, right? And there is a list of things that people throw in the bottom of the planting hole on tomatoes, including aspirin, Epsom salts, vinegar, eggshells, Tums, and on and on. And really, if you put compost on your soil, you don't need any of those things, okay? So what happens is people get to micromanaging their soil, and you can actually goof it up, okay? Because if you add too many eggshells, too much calcium, that can interfere with the plant's ability to take up magnesium. And if you add magnesium, which is what Epsom salt is, and you get those levels up too high, that affects plants' ability to take up calcium. And both of those can get excessive and make your plants not able to take up phosphorus. So it does get scientific that way. And we're not going to get into all of that, but the bottom line is compost has everything that you need in it, except for probably a little extra nitrogen fertilizer. So there's going to be usually plenty of phosphorus in there. And there's likely going to be kind of a low analysis of nitrogen, and all plants do better with some extra nitrogen. And that's why it's likely that you would still want to fertilize with some extra nitrogen. But if you put compost on your garden every year, that's all you're probably going to need for fertilizer. Now, of course, the extension agent in me is going to tell you that every 5 years you should do a soil test, because we want to check your pH. We want to make sure your phosphorus and potassium levels are high enough. Likely they are. And then you would know for sure that all you need to add is nitrogen to your plants. But that's the beauty of compost. It has all of those trace nutrients in it, the micronutrients and the trace nutrients. So you don't have to worry about adding Listerine and aspirin, which I don't actually know what the aspirin is supposed to do, but all of those little things that are not measurable. And there's one out there where people put a whole egg at the bottom of the hole for the tomatoes. Not really sure what that would do, because at the end of the year the egg is still whole, so it's not like it broke down and released anything. But again, compost is all you're going to need. So what you need to make compost are your work crew, okay? And your work crew are microbes, mostly bacteria, fungi. There's going to be some bigger things like worms and beetles and millipedes and, you know, some of those creepy crawly things that are in there. But basically what they're doing is they are eating that stuff that you put on that pile, those leaves, those weeds that you pulled, the leaves that you raked up, um, the yard cleanup stuff. That's their food source, okay? And so they eat it and they poop it out, and then something smaller eats their poop and poops that out, and something smaller eats their poop and poops that out, and eventually it gets broken down into the tiny little mineral that is needed and available for the plant to suck up in its root, okay? So your biggest thing that you have to think about is, just as if you owned a business, you have workers and you need to keep your workers happy. Okay, so that's all these microbes and stuff. So you need them there. They're going to be there. Okay, this is not something you need to worry about. They're everywhere. They're in the soil, they're on the leaves, they're on the plants and stuff. But when there's a big food source, their population will explode. And that's what we're looking for. Okay, so then we also need food for those decomposers, and that's the organic material or the stuff that was once a plant, and that needs to be there. If there's not enough food source, they're going to die off, right? And then we need oxygen because these microbes need to breathe, and we need water because they can't dry out, and we need it to be warm enough for them to be active. So just like insects, you know, they're not active in the winter because they're cold-blooded. They don't have the circulatory system that mammals have. So if it's cold out, they become inactive. And that's why we don't get composting in the winter in most cases. And that's okay, right? But those are the things that we need in order to make compost. So those decomposers, like I said, they're everywhere. You build a pile, they will come. So they're already on stuff. And these are all beneficial things. So don't get all, you know, worried about, oh, microbes and stuff. After a year of COVID, we're kind of worried about these little microbes, but these are all good microbes, harmless to people, and they do a tremendous amount of work for us. So anytime that you throw anything on that pile, you are adding microbes. If you want to be absolutely sure, if you're building a pile, throw a scoop or two of soil in there with your leaves and grass clippings and kitchen waste and all that stuff, and you will be adding 1 billion microbes in a scoop of soil. So, so don't worry about the microbes. In fact, you will see things like this on the shelves in the store, compost maker and that sort of thing. So these are the starters kits, they call them, and these are supposedly the microbes. You do not need these. Don't spend money on them. Really not necessary. Like I say, throw a scoopful of soil on instead, and you'll have everything that you need. So don't bother with these packaged things. Now, there are a few things that I'm going to tell you right off the bat to avoid with building a compost pile, and that's lime. Okay, so barn lime or soil lime. This can increase the pH too high, and it makes those microbes, the ones that we want, it makes it inhospitable to them, and then other microbes come in, and those microbes are a little more slimy. And so then you can get some odor, some ammonia, strong ammonia or odor. And then also if your pH of your compost is super high, then when you put that in your garden, you might be having your soil pH too high as well. Okay. Wood ash, you know, like if you have your fireplace and you want to clean that out, tossing a little bit of wood ash on your compost pile or even directly onto your garden soil is not bad. Okay. There's nothing magical and desirable about it. Okay. But wood ash is very high in pH. And so again, if you put too much of that on, it's going to kill off the really good microbes. encourage some of the slimier microbes, and then we'll get that ammonia color and stuff, or ammonia smell. So a little bit, if you clean out your fireplace from, 10 logs that burn down and you throw that on there, you know, every other week, not a problem, but don't overdo the wood ash. Okay. There are nutrients in wood ash, that's true, but too much of anything is not good, right? And then you want to make sure that you don't put any kind of pesticide treated materials on that compost pile. So if you spray your lawn for dandelions and then you mow your grass clippings and you put them on your pile, then that dandelion weed killer is in your compost pile. Now, this is not as big of a problem as it has been in the past because the herbicides that are available now break down pretty quickly. In past, 20 years ago or so, there were instances of municipal compost, people taking that and taking it home and putting it on their plants, and things were dying all the time because there were some pesticides out there that were that didn't break down. Those have pretty much been pulled off the market. So it's really not as big of a concern as it was 20 years ago or so. But still, especially if you're going to be putting this compost in a vegetable garden or something, you probably don't want pesticides or herbicides in your compost. So if you sprayed some weeds or something with Roundup, or if you've treated your lawn, give it some time before you collect that stuff and put it in the compost pile. So if you spray your lawn for dandelions in fall, like in September, which is the best time to do it, you shouldn't have any major weeds by spring. And so your grass clippings the next year, that's just fine, okay, because it's been a long time since you used that weed killer. It's just you don't want to, collect those clippings 2 weeks after you sprayed, because they will be coated in that weed killer. And again, we don't have that big of a problem with the herbicides that are on the market anymore. It used to be where there were some that if you sprayed the weeds and then you mowed that grass and you put that grass fresh around your plants, it could kill them. And we still don't recommend doing that because those herbicides can volatilize, but just be aware of that. So we're going to try to keep pesticides off the compost pile. Shredding. So if you have a leaf chopper or something like that, the smaller particles on your compost pile will decompose faster. And that's because there's more surface area there for those microbes to attack and eat. Okay. If you have a big chunk, they're going to have to eat that outer edge and then work their way in. Whereas if it's chopped up into smaller pieces, that's a more surface volume, those microbes can get at it. So if you have the ability to chop things up before you put them on your compost pile, that's really good. You don't have to have a chipper shredder kind of thing like in this picture here, but let's say you're collecting your leaves in fall, you have a lot of leaves falling on your lawn. If you just run over them several times with your lawnmower, it will chop them up into a lot smaller pieces. And then you collect that and put it on your compost pile. It will break down faster and turn into compost faster. So that's going to speed things up for you. It's always good, though, to have some bigger chunks in there, maybe some little twigs, maybe some, things that aren't chopped up too much, because that helps to create some porosity in the pile that allows oxygen to get down in there and to the depths of the pile. Now, if you chop things too small, it can settle too much and therefore decrease airflow into the pile. So think about if you take, let's go back to cookie crumbs. You might not want to eat cookies after this, but let's say you take graham crackers, okay, and you crush them up in a Ziploc bag to make your graham cracker crust for your cheesecake. They have, you can see that there's chunks and clunks, but there's like air can get through them and they're light and fluffy. If you take those same graham crackers and you put them in a blender and you just blended it all the way down, it would basically get down to flour. And there won't be the opportunity for air to get in there. And if you pour water on the crushed up graham cracker crumbs, it'll soak right through. If you pour it on if you've ever done any baking, you put flour in a bowl and you pour liquid on top, it kind of sits on top for a while. It takes a while for that to soak in. And so that's the difference. And we don't want it so fine that water and air can't get in there, because then you've got the microbes aren't going to be down in there. You're not going to get it to be breaking down, but you can also get anaerobic conditions. And that means, again, a whole different set of bacteria and microbes. If they're adapted to anaerobic air conditions where there's no oxygen, those are the ones that stink. Okay, so we don't want anaerobic conditions. If you do have smaller particles, you can counteract that just by turning your pile more often to get oxygen in there. But again, smaller chunks decompose faster. Keep a few bigger chunks in there and just don't get them too tiny. Okay. So more about food for your decomposer. So just like us, your decomposers, your microbes need a balanced diet. Okay, so we need our protein, we need our carbohydrates, we need our fats and that sort of a thing. And with microbes, if you think in terms of carbon and nitrogen, that's what the microbes need to flourish. And again, it's just like with anything, you know, if there's a good food source, population increases, because hey, lots of food, we can feed our children, let's have babies. But if food is scarce, they aren't going to reproduce as much. And we want as many microbes as possible because they're doing the work, right? So carbon and nitrogen need to be in the proper ratio in order to feed the microbes well. And to simplify it, think of it as browns and greens. So anything that you throw on your pile that is brown or dry is going to be higher carbon to nitrogen ratio than something that's juicy and fresh. Okay, so the basic ratio, if we were building a compost pile from scratch right now, we would want a pile of brown stuff and we'd want a pile of green stuff. And we would throw 3 scoops of brown on, 1 scoop of green, 3 scoops of brown, 1 scoop of green. Okay, so as you can see here, it would be 3 parts brown to 1 part green. Okay, now browns, again, they're high in carbon, and that's going to be things like straw, paper, shredded paper. Shredded newspaper is fine to throw on a compost pile. Sawdust is super high in carbon. You can see that it's about 500 to 1 for the ratio of carbon to nitrogen. Leaves are less, it's 30 or to 80 to 1. So this is amount of carbon, and this 1 is parts of nitrogen in there. Okay, so it varies. If you're putting leaves on there, if they're really dry and brown and crispy, they'll be higher in carbon because a lot of the nitrogen is already leached out. If they're partially green yet, they'll be lower in carbon. Animal bedding mixed with manure. So I have horses and they go in their stalls, and we bed their stalls with wood shavings, but they poop and pee on it. The poop and pee is high nitrogen. The shavings are high carbon. So once that gets kind of mixed together, we're looking at about 30 to 80 to 1. Okay, but just think of it as, again, if it's dry, if it's older, it's going to be considered a brown. Now, there are some brown colored things that are not really high carbon. So like fresh coffee grounds are higher in nitrogen than dried leaves are. And, you know, a kiwi skin is brown, but really it's high nitrogen. Okay. But just, and again, this is our general thinking that we want. We don't, it's not like, it doesn't have to be exact. Okay. But these are browns. Okay. Greens are higher in nitrogen, and those will be things like your kitchen scraps. So they're 12 to 20 parts carbon to 1 part nitrogen. Okay, so higher nitrogen to carbon percentages there. Coffee grounds, again, are, even though they're brown, they're considered a green. Okay, grass clippings are high nitrogen, so that's definitely considered a green. The fresh, actual mature or manure, like as I mentioned, is higher nitrogen. Okay, if it's mixed in with the wood shavings or straw, that adds carbon to it. But anything that's fresh out of your kitchen, so banana peels, orange peels, lettuce, your broccoli scraps when you're cutting up your broccoli, all that sort of thing, those are considered greens. Okay, now one of our challenges that we face here in Wisconsin, at least, is that we tend to accumulate a lot of greens during spring and summer, and a lot of browns in the fall when the leaves turn and dry up and stuff like that. So sometimes what's good to do if you want to build a compost pile every year is to collect some leaves and put them in a, one of those big pumpkin bags or something, or on a pile somewhere, and save them over winter so that you have them in spring. Because in spring, when we start cutting grass, now ideally you're leaving the grass clippings on your lawn to recycle the nutrients right there on the lawn, but it's okay to collect clippings once or twice for the sake of building a compost pile. But those little weeds that you pull when they're only 6 inches tall and haven't gone to seed yet in spring, and now in summer as well, those can all go on the compost pile, and those would be considered a green. Okay, now again, we're talking about building a compost pile from scratch. A lot of us just keep throwing stuff on the pile as the year goes on and as we collect things, and that's a slower way of composting, but perfectly wonderful. And it's still important to remember the whole brown carbon to nitrogen ratio thing and what your microbes need in order to make sure that that slower build it as you go pile is actually composting. Okay, so just think browns and greens. If it's fresher and juicier, it's a green. If it's drier and older, it's a brown. And you want 3 parts brown to 1 part green for the perfect building of a compost pile. Okay, so that's just the simple way to think of it. So the browns that are in there are going to decay slowly, whereas the greens decay rather rapidly. So you know that grass clippings, you mow your lawn and they actually decompose on the lawn within a couple of weeks. They fall down in between the grass blades and they disappear. Okay, browns are usually coarser and stiffer, so that helps to keep the pile aerated, versus greens, they can compact because of the moisture in them and the juiciness of them. So you've probably all seen a pile of green grass clippings. It sits there for a couple days and then you flip it over and it's moldy in there. And that's because it compacted fat and there wasn't oxygen in there. And so it didn't have the aeration, and then that's when you get mold and sliminess. Okay. Again, browns we tend to get in the fall, greens we get in spring and summer. Browns, if you just put brown stuff, like if you put the leaves directly in your soil without composting them first, the microbes that are going to go after them, those microbes also need nitrogen. And so they'll pull the nitrogen out of the soil and perhaps away from your plants. So that's why we want to compost things first and not just put it directly in the soil. The greens supply that nitrogen in the pile to get those browns composted. Okay, so again, we might need to stockpile the browns in order to build a compost pile from scratch, because we tend to get them mostly in the fall. So aeration is super, super important. And this is where turning the pile comes into play. Now, there are a lot of different ways that you can provide oxygen into the middle of that pile. Here's a little picture with people put like pipes that have holes drilled in there. When you build the pile, you can put sticks in it and stuff so that eventually you can just go shake those sticks and kind of help stir things. Turning the compost pile is usually not a fun job, right? And so most of us don't turn it as often as we should. If you have a tractor with a front end loader, that's the way, we'd love to be able to do it. But we do have to turn it. But the main reason that we're turning it is when we build that pile, okay, if you build a pile, that's a big food source for the microbes, okay? But the microbes aren't going to eat on the edges because it's drier there, it's cooler there. They're all in the middle. So if you build a pile, you will get it will heat up, and it will heat up to 140 degrees within 3 days. It's pretty amazing. And you can get compost thermometers. They're about 1.5 feet long. Looks like a big meat thermometer, and you can stick that in your pile and you can watch it heat up. And the reason it's heating up is it's the microbes, just like our bodies give off heat. When we break down our food, we perform respiration, which is the breaking apart of the molecules, the food molecules, and that gives off heat. And that's the same thing with the microbes. They are giving off heat as they digest the food. So their population will explode with the fresh food source. And then after 5, 6, 7 days, the temperature will start going down because microbes start dying off because the food source in the middle isn't that fresh anymore. So we need to turn the pile to bring the materials that are on the outside of the edge back into the center for food for those microbes. And then it will heat up again as the microbe population expands, okay? That also brings oxygen in there because as it settles in the middle, as those microbes eat it, it will get less and less porous. And so oxygen doesn't get in there as well. So the whole pile compacts, and then decomposition really, really slows down. So you can turn your pile in any way you want. You can put sticks in there or pipes in there. There are tools that you can find, like this one here on the right. I had one of these once. I don't actually remember what happened to it, but you stick it into the pile, and as you pull it out, these little wings open up and kind of pull it out, and you just keep sticking it in, pulling it out, and that helps to turn the pile. One of the easiest ways to do it is to have 2 piles or 2 bins like this gentleman on the left has. And every 2 weeks or so, however, whenever you want to do it, you just go and you scoop it out of one and you put it in the other. And that right there just turns it as much as you need to, okay? You can also buy tumblers. There are all kinds of composters that are made of usually black plastic. Some of them are like on a stand, and you just turn the crank. I caution you on those because a lot of times they say compost in 14 days, and that's not real. You can't make compost in 14 days. You can probably make it in 5 to 6 weeks in one of those things, but because you're turning it. But the key, the main thing you have to remember is a compost pile or bin or whatever needs to be large enough, okay? A tiny little pile isn't going to compost much because there's not enough food and environment in there for a good microbe population. So generally speaking, we want a cubic yard to be really good at composting. Not that something smaller than that won't eventually compost, but if you're looking for, a good, speedy, efficient composting, you want a cubic yard. So a bin that's 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, 3 feet deep, okay? And a lot of those tumbler things and stuff just aren't quite that big. And so that's kind of makes it difficult for them to live up to their promises of compost in 14 days or so. But one way or another, if you want to actively compost, you need to turn your pile occasionally. Now, how often? Well, in a perfect world, we would wave our magic fairy wand and the compost pile would turn itself every week. But we don't all have that kind of time or desire. So even if you go out there every few weeks and you fuss around with it a little bit and you stir it up at least some, that's going to speed up the process. Okay. And again, there are tools out there. There are great pitchforks. There are front end loaders. There are teenage children that did something wrong and need punishment, and you can tell them to go turn the compost pile as punishment. However you can get it done. If you turn it, you do not want to turn it more than once a week, because then you're really kind of not going to get it heated up as much, because the microbes won't really get established in there. But the more you turn it, the faster you're going to get your compost. The other thing is water. Microbes, as with every other living thing on earth, need some moisture, need some water. Okay. If it's too dry, the microbes will just become inactive and they won't be doing their job. If it's too wet, that will keep the oxygen out and you're basically drowning your microbes. And so that'll lead to that anaerobic conditions again, where things start to get smelly and that sort of thing. So when you're first filling your bin or making your pile, if you squirt a little bit of water on it in between layers, that's a good thing. When you turn it, you should check the moisture in it. So it should feel about as damp as a wrung out sponge. Okay, so there shouldn't be any like free water or wetness visible, but when you touch it or squeeze it, it should also kind of like want to think about clumping together at least. You don't want it so dry that it just falls apart. And if it is too dry, the decomposition process will stop. So then when you turn it, just throw some water on it. Throw a bucket here or there, or turn on the hose and get it dampened back up. Okay, we've had a really dry year this year. We just got some rain finally, but it could very well be that compost piles out in the hot sun were getting pretty dry. Okay, so you might need to add some water occasionally. Normally in Wisconsin, if your compost pile is out exposed to the rain, that's going to add the water that you need. But in a case like this, with this bin, this compost bin that's in this picture here, it has a lid with a cover on it. So when it rains, the rain wouldn't actually get in it. So you would have to check that occasionally to make sure that there's enough moisture in there. So the most rapid composting, again, is going to be if you build a pile and you have this perfect mixing of 3 parts of brown to 1 part green. You water it a little bit as you build that pile, and then you turn it every week or 2, and you're going to get compost in a good fast amount of time. So the volume of your compost is going to deplete from where it starts to, by the time it's finished, it's going to be about 1/3 the volume. Okay, so you can see here's bin number 1, and these 3-part compost bins are really nice because this is where you're throwing all your new stuff is on this pile here. And then as you turn it, you dump it into the next one. And then as you turn that, you dump it into the next one, and it will be breaking down with every turn. And here's your usable stuff that you're going to scoop out and put in your garden as you need it. Okay. So as I said, the pile, what's going to happen when you build the pile is it will heat up to a good 140 degrees within 3 to 4 days. And that's because the microbe population blows up. A thermometer is great to have. Otherwise, you can just stick your hand down in it and see how hot it is. And then when it starts, when you start doing that and it's feeling like it's cool in there, you know it's time to turn it. It'll heat up again. Okay. Maybe this time it'll only get to 130 degrees. And again, after it cools down, you turn it, and then maybe it's only going to heat up to like 90 degrees or so. And that's because a lot of the food is already being broken down by the microbes in there, so the population of microbes doesn't spike so high. That heating is really beneficial because what that does is it kills most weed seeds if there are any in there. Ideally, you never weeds are great to throw on the compost pile unless they have flowered and set seed. If they're still in the flower, go ahead and throw them on there. But if they have set seed, don't put them on your compost pile because your compost might then carry weed seeds to your garden later on. But if it heats up properly to 140 degrees, that will kill most weed seeds. It also kills most plant diseases. So if you had um, uh, some kind of fungal disease on your leaves and you threw them on your compost pile and they heated up, well, that's going to kill them in most cases. Okay. If you're doing the, and I don't want to actually call it the lazy man's composting, but if you're doing the build it as you go kind of composting, your pile isn't going to heat up. And so those kinds of piles, you definitely don't want to throw any kind of diseased plants on because without getting that heat, it won't kill them off. Okay, so if you're just tossing stuff on a pile all year long and a year later you dig down to the bottom of that pile and there's some finished compost, that's great. That's a fine way to compost. That's mostly what I do. But again, you have to be more careful about diseased plants in that case because you're not getting that heat. Okay, so after you've turned it 4 or 5 times and it's no longer heating up after you turn it, that means that it's really, by that point, you're probably not recognizing what's in there anymore. So you're not going to recognize that milkweed leaf or that banana peel anymore because it's going to be more kind of dark and crumbly sort of a thing. Then you can just let it sit. It should cure for about 4 weeks because it'll still be decomposing. It's just not going to be heating up. And after 4 weeks or so, it's probably usable. Now there may still be a few things, especially if you had some twigs in there or something that was a little woody because that takes longer to break down. There may still be some things in there that are recognizable, but you can still use it. Okay, most of it won't be recognizable. And after it's heated up 4 or 5 times and then sat for 4 weeks, you're ready to use it. So if you're building a pile now, you could definitely get compost to work into your garden this fall. And certainly it would be ready to be using for the springtime. Compost can be used for like mulching between perennials or in annual beds, adding it to container plantings, for all kinds of great things. So you can use it throughout the year. But like I said, even if you can still recognize a few twigs or wood chunks or something like that in there, it should be usable by then. It should smell like, if you take a handful of it and you smell it, it's going to kind of smell like earth. Okay. And then you know that it's fine. If it's got some kind of a weird smell, especially something ammonia or strong that makes your eyes water, then don't use it yet. Okay. But we want that main composting done because again, if you put unfinished compost, if the carbons in your soil, the microbes will go after it and they'll pull nitrogen out of the soil. But if it's at least mostly composted, that won't be a problem. Okay. So the cool pile that I just mentioned, again, it's not the lazy person's compost, it's the laid back composters. Okay, those of us that are kind of laid back, we're just going to throw things on a pile as it accumulates. Okay, so kitchen scraps, weeds that we pulled, the mowed up leaves, the vegetable garden cleanup in the fall, that sort of a thing. If you can chop it up, like I say, run your lawnmower over it, and then put that on your pile. We're just going to build that compost pile as you accumulate it. We water it, we turn it when possible, when we think of it, or again, when a teenager needs punishment or something. But what's on the top is going to kind of remain recognizable, but on the bottom of that pile, especially if it's a big enough pile, it's going to be composting. And so then after, like stuff that you're throwing on there now, next spring is probably compost, and you can dig it out down there and you can use it. So you don't have to have a dedicated bin. You don't have to have a dedicated where you build a pile all at once. you can still get compost just like nature would do by dropping stuff on there whenever it's available. Okay. And in most cases, it's going to take more like a year to get finished compost versus the active heating up pile you can get in a couple of months. So compost is finished again when it looks like this, those Oreo cookie crumbs. It smells good. It's going to be dark brown. It's going to be kind of crumbly. It's going to smell earthy. You're not going to have a lot of things that you can still recognize in there. Maybe a wood chunk or a twig or something that's really, you know, slow to decompose. And you can pull that stuff out of there. If you've got some big chunks when you use your compost, just pull the big chunks out and throw them back on the pile or on a new pile. And again, it will go down to about a third of the original volume. And if you turn it, it won't reheat. Okay, that's really a key, because if it reheats, that means there's still undecomposed food for microbes in there. So turn it, if it doesn't heat up, let it sit for a few weeks, and then you're ready to use it. So troubleshooting. Sometimes you get some odors on there. And if something, compost pile, a good compost pile should not smell. So your neighbor should not have any complaints for it, okay? But if you are getting like a rotten egg smell, something like that, that's an indication that you've got an anaerobic condition going. So that could mean that the pile's too wet, if it's getting rained on too much, or if it's in a place where water runs through. If it's excessively moist, that gets different microbes in there, and that will cause that. If you haven't turned it, if it got really compacted and there's no oxygen getting into it, that could start calling that. So your solution is just to turn the pile, add some more dry stuff, some brown things, okay? And try to like dry that out and get some more oxygen in there, and the problem should get better. If you're throwing a lot of, especially like broccoli, cauliflower, those cruciferous plants on your pile, those things naturally have kind of a rotten egg sulfur smell, okay? So if that's the case, when you, rather than just throw it on the top of your pile, dig a little hole in your pile and throw them in the middle, and that way you won't smell those kinds of things, okay? If you're getting an ammonia smell, that means there's too much nitrogen and maybe too many greens in there. So if you can just kind of turn the pile and add some more dry stuff in there, that's going to solve that problem. So again, leaves if you have them, straw, even dry grass clippings. So if you need browns in the summer, if you collect some grass clippings and you spread them out like on your driveway or something for a couple days, and they dry up and they're brown, now they're a brown. When they were green, they were greens. If they're dry, they're browns. And so you can use that to balance the high number of greens that we get during the spring and summer. But usually if you're getting some kind of odors, it's an easy fix just by adding the right thing and turning it and getting some air in there. If your pile isn't heating up like you want, make sure that it's big enough, okay? And again, about a cubic yard, 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide, you're going to heat up easily. I've done composting classes where I've built a pile like 2 days before the class, just using one of those little bins, like a wraparound of chicken wire, and it wasn't even that big, but they still heat up really, really fast. So if you're not getting the heat up that you think you should have, maybe your pile's too big. Again, if it's winter, it's not going to happen. Although if your pile is big enough, composting will happen right through winter. So as I mentioned, I have horses and stall cleanings, and I have this kind of big manure pile. And in winter, we'll get snow, and 2 days later, the snow is melted off the top and the pile is steaming, because deep down in, these microbes are still at work. But if it's cooler weather, your microbes are going to be less active. Also check the moisture. Again, if it's too dry, your microbes will die off and be inactive. So give it a little drink, fluff it up, turn it, or add some green stuff. And that usually kickstarts it into active composting again. So if it's in winter and you want to be composting, people have done all kinds of things of insulating the sides of the bins, using like bales of hay or straw or styrofoam, things like that. Most of us don't care if our compost piles stop working in winter, but if you really want to keep at it, you can try things like that. And if your pile gets too hot, which is not common, but if you built a really monstrous pile, you know, like 10 feet tall and 10 feet wide because you collected everybody in the neighborhood's yard waste and that sort of a thing, you can get it really hot in there. And then you can start getting some weird odors and stuff like that. Not usually an issue, but just stirring that pile is going to fix that problem as well. And then there are the animals, okay? So most of the time, dead plants, which is what we're throwing on compost piles, these things don't like. If you're throwing some fresh kitchen scraps like broccoli on there, ooh, you know, that's the best thing to bait a woodchuck trap with. So they might show up to eat that sort of thing, okay? But do not put any kind of fatty things, meat scraps, that sort of thing. So think of it this way: if you make broccoli for dinner and you have and you steam it on your stove and you have leftovers, you can throw that on your pile if it's steamed. But if you put butter on it and your kids didn't eat it, don't put that on the compost pile, because that butter on there is going to goof things up. That's a whole different set of microbes that would be needed to decompose that fat. And these critters that are on the screen, they like butter too. So that's the kind of thing that's going to draw them in. So no hot dog buns, no you know, breadcrumbs, things like that. It needs to have been a plant, and it needs to have been not processed. Okay. Now, the other thing is that manure. So if you have access to some manure to throw on your pile, that's a really, really good thing to add a lot of those micronutrients and the microbes and get your carbon and nitrogen balance good. But remember, no pet waste. Okay. Dogs and cat poop should not ever be put on a compost pile. So any kind of manure that you use on the compost pile or in your gardens and stuff needs to be from a vegetarian. Okay, so chickens, goats, horses, cattle, sheep, rabbits, but not dogs and cats who eat meat. Okay, those kinds of things will also draw critters in. If you don't put the wrong thing on your pile, you're not likely to get these critters in there. If for some reason you have some rogue wildlife that keeps digging in your pile, well, maybe they're just trying to help you with aerating it and turning it. But if it does become a problem, then you probably need to put some kind of a fencing around it to protect it so that they don't get in there. But again, usually as long as you're just putting plant stuff on there, it's not an issue. Now, there's another way of composting called vermicomposting, which is a whole different thing. Okay, and that's where you have a bin, you have these certain worms, these red wiggler worms in there, and you throw your kitchen scraps in there and they eat it all up and you get compost. Okay, so that's a different kind of a discussion. Okay, but it is another way to get compost and to get composting year round, because you can have it in your garage and those worms just do their jobs in there, and you can get compost year round, but you're not going to be doing it on as big of a scale as building a 3 by 3 by 3 foot pile outside. Okay. Another way that you can do some composting, or if you don't want to have a big compost pile, is you can still add the benefits of compost through what's called trench composting. So basically what you do is, like, maybe you have your vegetable garden this year and you have your stuff growing, and you dig a trench a little ways away from your crop that's growing right now, and you just throw your kitchen scraps down in there, and then you bury it, and that stuff will break down underground. Okay, so you're still adding organic matter, you're adding nutrients and stuff down there, but you don't actually have a pile. The thing to keep in mind with this is make sure that it's at least a foot or two away from your desired crops, okay? Because not only do you not want to risk damaging the roots of your crops that are growing, but because this is going to get microbes going and they're going to be pulling nitrogen and stuff, and we don't want to be pulling nitrogen away from your desired plants. Okay, so this is called trench composting, and again, it's just another way. If you don't have space for a pile or a bin, but you want to still recycle your kitchen scraps or your yard waste, you can do it just by burying it. And then, you know, the next year when you dig this up and loosen it up to plant, it will all just be compost down there in the soil. And that is the end of my simple presentation. Now, the bottom line is don't make it too complicated, okay? Really just think about what do your microbes need because they're doing the job for you. And then think about what their food source is and their water. And if you manage your herd of livestock in that bin, you will get compost. And don't worry if things stop working, then you just stir it. You add what you need, whether it's water, greens, or you know, some more food, and it'll kickstart and it'll get going again. Compost happens. Okay, it's going to happen. We just want to kind of speed it along, but food for your microbes, warm enough temperatures, moisture, and air is what you need. I see some questions are popping up in the chat. One just popped up is, does it matter where you put your compost bin, in the sun or the shade? It doesn't, okay? Because it'll be a little warmer in the sun, it might go a little faster than if it's in the shade, but it'll compost in the shade just as well. So, okay, I'm going to go through the chat here and see if there are any other questions. So one question came up of, what do you think of hugelkultur, which is it's a larger scale method of basically putting like some wood, like logs and stuff down at the bottom, and then putting your soil over that. And those logs, as they decompose, they are composting down there and they release nutrients, they hold moisture, that sort of a thing. It's not like better or worse than it. I mean, it's got its pros and cons. It's a way to create like a raised bed with that wood decomposing down underneath. Okay, so it's more of a gardening method than a composting method. And if you have a bunch of logs, or if you have a space where there are things like that, and that's the only space you have to garden, and then you throw your soil over that and that kind of thing, it's fine. But it's, you know, as with everything, it's not like a magical bullet sort of a thing. So it has its place and it has its benefits, but again, it's more of a gardening method. And then adding scraps to the soil with dirt in between the crops. Yeah. So the other question is, trench composting pull nutrients from the soil while it's composting? It can, and that's why I said to make sure that it's at least a foot away from any crops that are currently growing. It won't pull any farther than that, okay, because the microbes aren't going to go any further than that. But you don't want it right up against your crops that are growing. You don't want it in their root zone, because it can, those microbes are better at pulling especially nitrogen out of the soil than your crops are. So if you put anything fresh right next to your crops can suffer a nitrogen deficiency. So just make sure there's a good foot and a half in between, and you won't have any problems with that. Let's see. So any tricks for saving browns for all summer because the amount we get, yeah. So the saving of browns, if, like I said, if you have leaves that are coming down in the fall, you can just pile them up on a big pile somewhere. They'll actually start decomposing down there a little bit. But if you're afraid they're going to blow away, you can put a tarp over them or some netting of or fencing of some kind. You can put them in those big garbage bags and just store them over winter so that you have them in the spring and summer when you're getting the greens. You can also, if you're needing browns, like I said, you can cut some grass clippings, lay them out to dry for a couple of days, and then use that. You can buy a bale of straw. That's a brown. So if you need that during your during the green phase, when we have all the greens in spring and summer, that's a way to get browns to mix in with things. So it kind of depends on the situation. It's if you got a lot of space, you can stockpile things. But if you're on a small lot in town, you can't. And so you might be a little more limited that way. But there are also, like I said, some of the communities have compost sites, and sometimes you can go there in the fall and get leaves and browns to bring home to add to your pile, if that's what you're looking for. But a lot of times, the bigger problem is finding greens in the fall so that we can mix things in. But any other questions? Well, if anybody gets any questions about composting or gardening or yards or gardens or anything like that, you can always find me. Just look up the University of Wisconsin Extension in Pierce County. That's where my office is. I'm part-time, so I work about 2.5 days a week. But you can always leave a message, and I can get back to you, and we can answer your questions and solve your problems. So, anything else?
Yeah. Anything else? Okay. Well, thank you everybody for joining us tonight. We're so glad to have you all here, and huge thank you to Diana for a great talk on composting, and I think you solved some of my problems. So I'm really excited to kind of go out there and see what I can do. So again, if you have any questions, you can get to Diana, or you can get in touch with the Hudson Public Library and I will get them to her. Other than that, I'd like to say thanks and have a good night.